I'm originally from the city of brotherly love. I moved from Philly to Pittsburgh over 20 years ago. My family and I settled into a small home just outside the city, and that's where I was when I received the news that would rock my world. In the winter of 2010, I received a phone call in the middle of the night announcing that my brother had been killed. He was shot by two men while he was selling weed. They attempted to rob him for the prize of a dime bag of marijuana. It would be 2 years before the trial would go to court, and I resolved I should go. But I thought deeply about why I was going and what I should expect to see. Am I looking for innocence? Am I looking for guilt? And if it's guilt, then who's to blame? My brother was working this underground economy to earn extra money, an extra income to support his family. It was his hustle. However, what he was doing was illegal. To sell marijuana wasn't right. But how did he get his hands on the weed? How do illegal drugs come into our community? And then there were the guns. There were two men, each held a gun, but only one of them pulled the trigger that killed my brother. Should they both be blamed for his death? And where did they get these guns? And why did they have the need to carry in the first place? What were all the conditions that made murder possible that night? I traveled to Philly for the trial. I was eager to see what justice looked like, what it felt like. I wanted to see the faces of those who were accused. I wanted to test my own capacity for forgiveness. I wanted to represent my family, but I was emboldened most because I thought it might be the last time I heard my brother's name spoken in public. Philippe Kukui. So I went. When I sat down in the courtroom, I was quickly approached by a security guard there who told me I was seated in the wrong place. I was unaware at the time that the courtroom was set up to reflect America's adversarial style of justice. Just like in a traditional wedding ceremony, there's a side for each party involved. Here in this courtroom, there's a side for the defense and a side for the prosecution. I was guided to the other side of the room and I took a seat. And there on my side, everything is in my family, in my favor, the favor of my family. Because my brother is the victim of homicide, the case is held by the Commonwealth State of Pennsylvania. We have the support of the Commonwealth. The state is on our side. We're seated behind the Assistant District Attorney. To my left, I can clearly see the jury. In the front of me, I can see the witness box. And behind us, behind the gallery, there's a room off to the side where we're invited to go to collect ourselves and to console one another. The prosecution comes through to talk to us, as do police as well. And they tell us, justice will be done. These guys are going to spend a lot of time in prison, they say. On the other side of the room are the accused, the defendants and their family, their friends, their witnesses. The situation is tense. We're set up as though we're divided. The actions and roles played on the night that my brother died bleeds over into us. We do not make eye contact. We're separate. But I feel like this is a nightmare. I feel like none of us wants to be here. And I'm sober enough to believe that if conditions had been just a few ticks different that night, I could possibly be seated on the other side of the room too. we're not so separate at all. There's a dual victim narrative that threads throughout our communities. But here today in this room, we're at war. At the outcome of the trial, the jury found the defendants both guilty on similar trial charges. And the judge determined that their sentence would be what would amount to be a lifetime. I sobbed when hearing the news. It felt like a painful type of contorted relief. I felt as though I got the answer that I wanted to hear, that I needed to hear. I mean, we won. But I knew in my heart and in my body that it wasn't winning at all. It wasn't an answer. Activist and scholar Angela Davis writes that in most parts of the world, it's taken for granted that who's ever convicted of a serious crime, they will go to prison. And it makes sense, right? You do the crime, you pay the time, as easy as that. But this ideology has made our nation into one of incarceration. And the numbers tell the story. In the US, there are 2.3 million people who are in prison. Although the United States houses 5% of the world population, we have 25% of those who are imprisoned. And there are 60% more people in prison than there are in our US military. California, the state, has more prisoners than do Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Singapore, and the Netherlands combined. Again, Davis writes, the prison is an inevitable and permanent feature of our social world. The end of the trial just meant a restart, a new beginning for us again without the life of my brother, and the members of the families of the defendants, for them as well. They would have to learn anew to live without their loved ones. At the end of the day, 3 young Black men, all still in their 20s, were taken from society, 1 in death and 2 others nearly in death by incarceration. Who would care for my sister's children? Who would help her to make ends meet? Who would stand in the gap? Wasn't this the charge of justice? I left the trial, the outcome, the fact that my brother was murdered like this with an indelible impression. I decided that it's not a prerequisite to forgive in order to believe that people should not be made to live in cages. And I decided to seek out other forms of justice. I returned to graduate school while studying restorative practices. I learned how to lead and engage courageous conversations about race through everyday democracy. And I studied restorative practices. Eventually, I earned my PhD in 2019, and I joined the Abolitionist Law Center in 2020. The Abolitionist Law Center is a public interest law firm organized for the purpose of abolishing race and class-based incarceration in the United States. The Court Watch program was initiated to hold courts accountable for the people transgressing through the criminal justice system. We look to the courts to meet the needs of the people to whom it purports to serve. And court watching is not new. It gets its legacy just after the modern civil rights movement, when people staged sit-ins for equal treatment. In the same way, we situate ourselves in the courtroom, which is normally quite insular. We're looking to interrupt the status quo there. We're looking to document and observe court proceedings to let our public know, as well as our allies, and build out actionable items. Because we're interested in transformation. And we need transforming. Where Black people make up 11% of Pennsylvania's population, Black people are 47% of the prison population. In Allegheny County, where Black people are 13% of the population, 69% of the jails in Allegheny County are Black. And when it comes to spending time in jail, Black people are spending 72 days in jail compared to 49 days on average in jail. With the uprising in response to the lynching of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the search for racial justice has come into the forefront of the public mind. And police brutality cannot be overstated. Far too many people have lost their lives to police violence. And there's violence in arrests. In the city of Pittsburgh, where 23% of the population is Black, 63% of all the arrests by the Pittsburgh City Police are made on Black people, and they're disproportionately high numbers involved when it comes to traffic stops and frisks and searches and seizures. The police stand next to the courts, which stand next to the system of incarceration. And court watchers illuminate the problems between state surveillance and mass incarceration. We should be focusing on ending cash bail and pretrial detention. We need to be setting up systems of community accountability. We need to be providing resources to our communities, including safe housing, education, public health care, and addiction treatment. Instead, the justice system is failing our communities. Too many people are being taken from their community in arrests, detention, and incarceration. But court watching is a patient type of protest, and it's a strategic activism. When we're in the courts, we see some terrible things. Sometimes we do, but we can't just call out in the moment and make our voices heard in that way. We rely on one another to be faithful to the process, believing that collective action gets things done. Last year, during the summer, we were invited to attend a federal hearing. And in this hearing, one of our student volunteers noticed the defendant who was on trial for being involved in a protest last year. He tried to raise his cuffed hand to get the attention of the clerk. However, no one noticed. It was only when the call broke that we were able to contact the defense attorney to let her know that her client needed help. She then reached out and met with her client and was able to meet his needs. This was an immediate success for us, but we know that others will take more time. On March 16th of last year, the courts essentially closed due to the pandemic, but our program had already attracted an essential group of volunteers. And emboldened by the uprising for racial justice, we were even more certain to get things done. We began to organize actions tangential to courtroom proceedings. We looked into the public records from the judicial system, and we were able to pick out dockets there. We could analyze these dockets according to the data that's inscribed. We see things like bail sets settings and preliminary arraignment judges. We see when their upcoming hearing is, we see demographics and zip codes, and we took all this information and published a Court Watch data docket report last year, and we're poised to come out with our next docket report in the coming months. We staged an Open the Courts campaign calling for the transparency of our courts, and we received remote access to the courts through telephone in August of last year to preliminary arraignments and motions hearings, and we were very happy to get video conferencing access in January of this year. At the end of the summer, we staged 7 days of action to bring attention to a notable judge of the Court of Common Pleas who had been cited for making racist remarks. We collaborated with Pittsburgh's Women March, and we saw him resign in November on the eve before his misconduct hearing was to begin. We realized that his example was just a symptom and his resignation not a cure for the racist patterns that are embedded throughout our judicial system. So we continue to do our good work, and we thrive. The Court Watch program set sail in just last year. With our eyes on the court, we're looking to hold the courts accountable for any ongoings there. We're ready to call out violations of human, civil, and constitutional rights. We're looking for justice. I came to this work because of the love of my brother, and I enjoy working with the passionate people. Just barely a year since we first began, and 3 months since we've had video conferencing access, we have now over 80 volunteers who are watching 200 proceedings each week, and we thrive. We keep our eyes on the prize, and our ultimate goal is to transform the justice system into one that prioritizes healing and accountability.